After Mom passed away, the world changed its color. Everything in the house looked the same, but it felt hollow, like life had been drained from the walls. Dad didn't speak much. He'd sit in the same chair every evening, staring at the empty space across the table where she used to sit. Sometimes, he'd hold her mug, though the tea inside went cold before he took a sip. The air between us was thick with things we couldn't say. Grief made us strangers. I tried to fill the silence with small talk, asking if he wanted dinner, if he'd been sleeping, if he needed company, but he'd only nod or shake his head. His eyes were red but dry. The man who once hummed songs while cooking now moved like a ghost through rooms that once echoed with laughter. I caught myself studying his face, searching for traces of the father I remembered, but grief had carved deep lines there. At night, I'd hear him walking around the house, opening drawers, standing in the hallway where Mom's scent still lingered. Once, I found him in their bedroom holding her old scarf, pressing it to his face as if breathing her in could bring her back. I didn't interrupt him. I just stood in the doorway, silent, afraid that any sound would break him completely. The days stretched on in quiet repetition. Morning tea left untouched, dinner eaten in silence, the same old black sweater hanging from the chair by the window. He wouldn't throw anything away, not even the wilted flowers by her photo. I kept waiting for him to cry, to let it all out, but he didn't. His pain was private, locked behind a wall I couldn't climb. I began to wonder if he blamed himself. For not taking her to the doctor sooner. For arguing with her that last week. For surviving. Maybe all of it. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but the words stuck in my throat. I was grieving too. I'd wake up at night reaching for my phone to call Mom, only to remember she wasn't anywhere I could reach. One evening, I found him sitting in the garden. The air was still, and the sky had that dull orange glow of early dusk. He was staring at Mom's rosebush, the one she loved most. The petals were starting to fall, but he didn't seem to notice. He looked smaller somehow, fragile, like a man who'd lost not just his wife but his direction. I stood behind him for a long time, unsure of what to do. Then, without planning it, I walked up and sat beside him. For a while, neither of us said anything. The silence wasn't peaceful, but heavy. I could feel his grief radiating beside me like heat. And in that moment, something inside me broke too. I turned to him and whispered softly, "You don't have to be alone forever, Dad." He didn't look at me right away. His shoulders stiffened, his breathing changed. For a second, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he exhaled, slow and shaky, and his hand trembled as he brushed away something from his eye. He didn't answer. He just stared ahead, eyes wet but still calm. But I saw something flicker there, something I hadn't seen since Mom's funeral. Maybe it was life. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe both. I didn't say anything more. I didn't know what made me say it in the first place. Maybe I was trying to comfort him. Maybe I was trying to comfort myself. Either way, it felt like opening a door that had been locked since the day she died. That night, the house felt different. Still quiet, still heavy, but not in the same way. I lay awake thinking about what I'd said, replaying the words in my head. You don't have to be alone forever. They sounded innocent when I said them, but the more I thought about it, the more weight they carried. Did I just give him permission to move on? Was I ready for that? For months, I'd told myself that keeping Mom's memory alive meant keeping everything frozen. Her clothes untouched, her books stacked exactly as she left them, her mug still on the shelf. Maybe Dad thought the same. Maybe that's why he'd been afraid to smile again. Maybe my whisper was the first crack in the ice. The next morning, he came to the kitchen earlier than usual. He looked tired, but his eyes were softer. He poured himself coffee, the first time he'd done it in weeks. When he saw me, he gave a small nod, barely a smile, but it was something. For the first time, I noticed how empty the chair across from him looked. It wasn't just a missing person, it was a missing part of him. And of me. I wanted to reach across the table, to tell him again that it was okay to feel, to live, to even love again someday. But I didn't. The whisper was enough for now. Over the next few days, something shifted quietly. He started opening the windows in the morning, letting sunlight back into the house. He picked up the mail again. He trimmed the rosebush. Small things, but they mattered. Sometimes I'd catch him humming under his breath while washing dishes, a tune I couldn't recognize. When I asked him what it was, he said, "Just something your mom used to like." His voice cracked halfway through, but he smiled anyway. Watching him, I realized grief doesn't vanish, it just changes shape. It becomes part of the air you breathe, the silence between words, the ache that softens over time. Maybe Mom would have wanted this. Maybe she would have wanted him to find light again, even if it wasn't with her. Still, a part of me wondered what would happen next. I didn't know that the words I whispered that night would set everything in motion, that they would become the quiet spark behind everything that followed. Sometimes, I think about that moment in the garden. The smell of damp earth, the sound of his breath, the weight of my own guilt pressing down on my chest. I didn't know it then, but that whisper, just a few soft words, would change the shape of our lives forever. After that night, something in my father began to shift. It wasn't sudden, more like watching a frozen river start to thaw. He started to open the curtains each morning, let the light touch the furniture that had been hidden in shadows for months. He even trimmed his beard, something he hadn't cared about since the funeral. I noticed the small changes first, the way he looked out the window longer than before, or how he began answering when I spoke. His voice, still quiet, no longer carried the weight of defeat. One afternoon, a soft knock echoed from the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, a woman stood there with a warm smile and a dish covered in foil. Her name was Elena. She said she used to be one of Mom's friends from the neighborhood, and she'd come by to check on us. I remembered her vaguely, her laugh at garden parties, her gentle way of speaking. Dad appeared behind me, surprised at first, then almost relieved. He invited her in. They sat in the living room while I made tea. Their conversation started awkwardly, small comments about how much the garden had grown, how quiet the street felt lately. But soon, I heard laughter. Real laughter. I froze for a second, holding the tray of cups, because I hadn't heard that sound in months. When I stepped into the room, Dad looked lighter. Elena was talking about how Mom used to scold her for overwatering the roses, and Dad smiled in a way I thought he'd forgotten how to. Over the next few weeks, Elena began visiting more often. Sometimes she brought homemade meals, sometimes just her company. She helped tidy the garden, saying Mom would have hated seeing her plants so dry. I'd watch them from the kitchen window, her in her light scarf, Dad kneeling beside her as they worked. The air between them seemed easy, natural, almost peaceful. At first, I told myself it was harmless. Dad needed a friend. Someone to pull him out of his loneliness. I wanted that for him, didn't I? But soon, something inside me began to twist. I'd find myself listening to their voices through the walls, his quiet chuckle, her gentle replies. I'd tell myself to stop caring, but I couldn't. It felt wrong to see anyone else sitting in Mom's chair, laughing in her space. One evening, I came home earlier than usual and found Elena still there. The sun was setting, and their conversation had softened into something tender. She was sitting close to him, their hands almost touching on the table. Neither moved them away. When she left that night, Dad stood by the door long after she was gone, looking down the street where her car disappeared. That image stayed with me. The next morning, I asked, trying to sound casual, "Is she coming again today?" He looked up, surprised. "Maybe." She said she'd bring over some cuttings for the garden. I nodded but didn't say more. I wanted to ask if he liked her. If he felt something beyond friendship. But the words wouldn't come out. I'd been the one who told him he didn't have to be alone forever. How could I take that back now? Still, I noticed the subtle changes. He began wearing his nicer shirts again. He trimmed his hair. He even started cooking small dinners, something he hadn't done since before Mom's illness. And every time he did, he'd make enough for two. One Sunday, Elena joined us for dinner. The table, once a place of quiet memories, filled with the sound of conversation again. She asked about my job, laughed at my sarcastic jokes, and complimented Dad's cooking. He looked proud, almost shy, but happy. After dinner, they washed dishes together while I pretended to read in the living room. I caught myself glancing toward the kitchen, hearing the clinking of plates and the rhythm of their low voices. It was domestic, ordinary, and that scared me more than anything. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were loud and heavy. I should have been grateful. He was smiling again. He was talking. But all I could think of was Mom, how she used to hum while setting the table, how she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when she was lost in thought. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was stepping into her space, slowly erasing her. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking, but the distance between what I said and what I felt kept widening. The whisper that once felt like kindness now felt like a mistake. I gave him permission to move on, but I hadn't realized how much it would hurt to watch him do it. Then one evening, I heard laughter again, this time softer, lower. I was walking down the hallway when I caught a glimpse of them through the half-open door. They were sitting close, their hands brushing as they reached for the same cup. The look that passed between them wasn't one of friendship. It was something deeper, something they hadn't said out loud yet but both understood. I stepped back quietly, heart pounding. I wanted to be angry, but all I felt was confusion. How could I blame him for wanting to feel warmth again? How could I resent him for finding it in someone who offered comfort? But then, how could I not? Over the next few days, their closeness became impossible to ignore. She'd touch his arm when she spoke. He'd glance at her like she carried sunlight in her smile. Every time she came over, the air shifted. I'd retreat to my room, pretending to work, but really I was listening, to their voices, their laughter, the pauses that meant more than the words themselves. Once, after she left, I asked him directly, "Do you like her?" He hesitated, then said softly, "She's been kind. That's all." But I saw the truth in his eyes. It wasn't just kindness. It was connection. The kind you can't plan or control. The kind that creeps in quietly when you think you've forgotten how to feel. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything that had changed. My whisper had opened a door I couldn't close. I told him not to be alone, but I hadn't thought about what would happen when someone else stepped through. Maybe grief doesn't end when you start to smile again. Maybe it just changes shape, turns into guilt, longing, confusion. Watching him move on felt like losing Mom all over again, but this time I couldn't blame fate. This time, I was the one who started it. And somewhere deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of something that would test us both in ways we weren't ready for. The line between comfort and something more blurred quietly, almost invisibly. What began as companionship turned into small, stolen moments, glances that lingered too long, silences that said too much. I saw it happening, though neither of them admitted it. Elena still came by with her gentle laugh and warm eyes, but the energy had changed. There was something electric in the air, something fragile and forbidden. Dad didn't talk about her. He didn't need to. The way he checked his reflection before she arrived said enough. He started wearing the cologne he hadn't touched in years, the one Mom used to love. The first time I noticed, I wanted to tell him it smelled wrong now, that scent belonged to someone else, but I bit my tongue. The house that had once felt lifeless now carried two kinds of ghosts, Mom's memory, and the guilt that came with watching someone else take her place. Every sound, Elena's laugh, Dad's footsteps, the low murmur of their voices, pressed against me like a secret I couldn't escape. One night, I came home later than usual. The lights were dim, only the living room lamp was on. I heard quiet talking, followed by silence. Then a soft sound, something between a sigh and a sob. I froze. Through the crack of the door, I saw my father sitting close to Elena on the couch, her hand resting on his. Neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with something unspoken but undeniable. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. He leaned forward slightly, just enough for their foreheads to touch. It wasn't passion, it was pain, shared and silent. I stepped back before they saw me, my chest tightening. I didn't know what hurt more, the sight itself, or realizing I wasn't angry. I just felt lost. That night, I lay awake thinking about him, about her, about Mom. I wanted to hate Elena, to paint her as the intruder who stole what wasn't hers. But when I closed my eyes, all I could see was my father's face. Worn, lonely, desperate to feel alive again. Maybe this was what grief did when left unchecked. It looked for warmth in the coldest places. The next morning, I couldn't pretend anymore. Over breakfast, I asked, "Are you and Elena?" I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to. He froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. A long silence stretched between us. Then, quietly, he said, "I didn't plan any of this." His voice cracked on the last word. I nodded, but my heart pounded. "Does it make you happy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at his hands. "It makes me remember what that feels like," he said. "And that makes me feel guilty." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The ticking of the clock sounded louder than usual. Finally, he said, "You told me I didn't have to be alone." I didn't understand what that meant until now. His words hit me like a blade. I had opened that door with my whisper. I had told him to let someone in. And now that he had, I wanted to shut it again. After that day, something between us shifted permanently. He stopped mentioning Elena, but her presence lingered in every corner of the house. Her scent clung to the cushions, her laughter echoed faintly in the hallway. When she stopped by, he looked both relieved and terrified. It was as if the guilt had become part of their connection, a thread binding them tighter instead of tearing them apart. Then came the night of the storm. The rain fell hard, rattling against the windows, thunder rolling in the distance. I was in my room, pretending to read, when I heard the front door open. I looked out the window and saw Elena running toward the house, drenched. Dad met her at the door, pulling her inside. For hours, they stayed in the living room, the light flickering from the storm outside. I could hear their voices, muffled and low, sometimes breaking, sometimes soft. I told myself not to listen, but I couldn't help it. Then I heard it, her crying, and his voice saying, "I can't lose someone again." When I stepped out quietly, I saw them sitting close together. His hand was on her cheek, brushing away tears. Then he leaned in, and for the first time, they kissed. It wasn't wild or rushed, it was slow, fragile, almost mournful. I turned away, my breath catching in my throat. That image burned itself into my mind, the sound of rain, their silhouettes, the weight of something that could never be undone. The next morning, the house was silent again. Elena had gone. Dad sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands. I poured him coffee, but he didn't drink it. His eyes looked hollow, like he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. "Does she make you happy?" I asked again. He didn't look up. "I don't know," he said softly. "Maybe she makes me feel less dead. But I don't know if that's the same thing." I wanted to tell him it wasn't. That Mom's memory was sacred, that this was wrong. But I couldn't. Because part of me understood. Grief changes people, it bends the rules, blurs the edges of right and wrong. It makes you reach for warmth even when your hands are trembling from guilt. Days passed. Elena stopped coming as often, and when she did, their smiles were forced, their words careful. Whatever they had shared that night had left them both shaken. The connection that once looked like healing now looked like something that carried its own kind of pain. Sometimes I'd find Dad sitting in the dark, staring at Mom's photograph. His lips would move slightly, whispering words I couldn't hear. Maybe apologies. Maybe confessions. I never asked. I didn't need to. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I joined him at the table. I didn't say anything at first. He looked at me, eyes tired, and whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen. I just wanted to feel close to someone again." I nodded slowly. "I know," I said. "But sometimes, feeling close to someone new means losing a piece of the one you loved." He looked at me, pain flickering in his eyes. "I already lost her. I don't want to lose myself too." The honesty in his voice broke something in me. For the first time, I saw him not as my father, but as a man, flawed, grieving, desperate. He wasn't betraying Mom out of lust or selfishness. He was trying to fill the emptiness that had been consuming him. Still, understanding didn't erase the hurt. The house felt heavier than ever, filled with memories that no longer fit neatly into place. Love and guilt had intertwined, turning everything into shades of grey. That night, I lay in bed, the sound of rain echoing faintly in the distance again. I realized that the whisper I'd spoken months ago had done more than give him permission to live. It had opened the door to every fragile, human thing that comes with trying to move on. Love, guilt, forgiveness, betrayal, all tangled together, impossible to separate. And though I didn't know it then, that storm hadn't been the end of anything. It was the beginning of the hardest truth we'd both have to face. Time passed, though neither of us kept track anymore. After the storm, everything between Dad and Elena changed. She stopped coming by as often, and when she did, the warmth that once filled the air was gone. Their conversations grew shorter, their smiles forced. It was as if the weight of what had happened sat between them, unspoken but always present. I could see it in the way Dad avoided her eyes, the way her laughter sounded hollow. Whatever they had found in each other had been replaced by guilt, and it showed. One morning, I found him sitting at the table, staring at a letter. His hands trembled as he folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. When he noticed me, he said quietly, "She's leaving town. Going to stay with her sister for a while." He didn't look sad, not exactly, just empty, like someone who had finally stopped fighting the inevitable. I wanted to ask if he loved her, but I didn't. Some questions don't need answers. They already live in the silence between words. After she left, the house returned to its old stillness. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one carried a different kind of weight, less about grief, more about regret. He moved through his days like someone trying to forget without erasing. The garden was quiet again, the flowers blooming unattended. He didn't touch them anymore. One evening, I came home to find him sitting by the window, the same spot where Mom used to read. The photo of her rested beside him, and for the first time in months, he spoke her name aloud. His voice cracked halfway through, but he kept talking, telling her how much he missed her, how lost he'd been without her, how sorry he was. I stood there in the doorway, listening, my chest tight. It was the first time he'd spoken about her like that since she died. He looked up and saw me. His eyes were wet, his face drawn but calm. "I think I tried to move on too fast," he said. But it wasn't about love. It was about not wanting to drown. I sat beside him, the same way I had that night in the garden months ago. "You were trying to breathe," I said softly. He nodded. "And in doing that, I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I hurt your mother's memory. I hurt you." I shook my head. "You were human, Dad. And humans make mistakes when they're hurting." He turned to me then, eyes full of the same grief I'd seen the day Mom died, but this time, it wasn't hollow. It was honest. "I wanted to feel something again," he said. "But I ended up feeling everything all at once." We sat there quietly for a long time, watching the light fade. The world outside was calm again. No storms, no visitors, just the soft hum of the evening. I realized that this was what healing looked like, not forgetting, not replacing, but learning to carry the pain without letting it define you. In the weeks that followed, Dad began to rebuild, piece by piece. He started volunteering at the local library, a place Mom used to love. He cooked again, not for anyone else, but for himself. He read old letters she had written and began keeping a journal of his own. I'd catch him smiling sometimes, not because he'd moved on, but because he was learning to live with the memory instead of running from it. One afternoon, I found him planting new flowers in the garden. Not roses this time, lavender. He said they reminded him of peace. I joined him without saying a word, kneeling beside him as we worked. The silence between us felt different now. Softer, warmer, no longer filled with guilt or regret. As we finished, I looked at him and said, "You know, I think Mom would have liked these." He smiled faintly. "She'd probably tell me I planted them wrong." We both laughed quietly, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel wrong to laugh. Later that evening, as the sun set and the air turned cool, I sat beside him on the porch. He looked tired but peaceful. The kind of peace that doesn't come from forgetting, but from forgiving, himself, the past, even the choices that had gone wrong. I thought back to that night months ago, the whisper I had spoken without realizing how powerful it would become. "You don't have to be alone forever, Dad." At the time, it felt like a small act of comfort. But it had set off everything that followed. The grief, the longing, the mistakes, the lessons. Now, as I sat beside him, I understood that those words hadn't been about permission to move on. They had been about permission to heal. I leaned closer and whispered again, "You're allowed to heal, Dad. Just don't forget who you are." He didn't answer right away. His eyes glistened in the fading light. Then he reached over, took my hand, and said, "I think I finally understand what you meant." For a long time, we just sat there, hand in hand, watching the sky fade from gold to grey. The house behind us felt alive again, not with noise, but with quiet acceptance. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer haunted us. They watched over us instead. As night settled in, I thought about everything we'd been through. The loneliness, the confusion, the fragile attempts at love, the guilt that nearly broke us. In the end, it all came back to that one moment in the garden. That whisper. That permission to keep living, even when it hurts. Maybe that's what love really is, not the kind that fades or betrays, but the kind that changes shape. The kind that stays, quietly, even after everything else is gone. When I went to bed that night, I heard him humming softly from the other room. The same melody Mom used to hum while cooking dinner. It wasn't sorrowful this time. It sounded like a man remembering, not mourning. As I closed my eyes, I realized something simple but profound. Grief and love aren't opposites, they live side by side. One doesn't erase the other. It teaches you how to hold both in your hands without breaking. And maybe that's what my whisper really did. It didn't change him in an instant. It changed how we both understood love, loss, and forgiveness. After Mom passed away, I whispered something to my dad, and it changed everything. Not because it led him astray, but because it made us both see what it means to be human, to love deeply, to fall painfully, and to find our way back, no matter how broken we've become.